Hi, I'm Josue Rodriguez, and this is the Misfit Gospel. Good news for misfits. So what's a misfit? Misfits are the outliers and the geniuses, the pastors and the pagans, the stay-at-home crunchy moms and the ones who should have listened to their moms, and so many more in between. So whether or not you feel like you're in one of these groups or whether you are, we all would agree it's time for some good news. Let's go. Welcome to the Misfit Gospel. I'm Josue Rodriguez, and the setup's a little different today because it's just me. I don't have a guest today. I just wanted to share a little bit of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and even more importantly, the story of how I got here. So, if you didn't know already, we're all misfits. Nobody fits in. Everybody's story is different. And around here, that's the thing we like to talk about. The difference is not why we're different, but how we're different. Because when we start talking about why, we start separating ourselves from each other, and we never find things in common. It's all about nuance and redemption and hope and help. That being said, so in 2018, I had this idea that I'd like to do something where I'm talking into a camera. I just didn't know what. So I told a friend of mine who was good with a camera, who had graphic design experience, and we just said, let's just go do something. So we went to a local skate park, and he set up his camera, and I just started talking. And we recorded for 10 minutes. He did a bunch of B-roll footage. We put it up on YouTube, and that's it. I had really no concept of being a YouTuber. I had really no concept of being a podcaster. I just thought maybe I could do something, and I really was not good at planning it out. Then in 2022, I found myself watching YouTubers, and I realized, oh, that's what I was thinking about doing. So I thought, well, maybe I can. But then the more I paid attention to how they had followers and viral videos and all this stuff, I thought, that's just too much for me. I don't think I can do that. And then later that year, I met someone at the church that I went to who had a podcast, him and his wife, and it was pretty successful. And I said, I think I want to do a podcast. And he said, what's it called? And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, what's it about? I said, I have no idea. And he said, well, what YouTube channels are you watching? And so he pulls them up, and he's looking at analytics, and he says, okay, this is their numbers, and this is the group they're reaching. And, you know, he rattled off more information. And I said, okay. He said, you hang out with misfits. You're always with skateboarders. And I'm like, yeah. He said, and you bring good news to them. And I said, yeah. I was like, because if you've already been watching, you know that my wife and I oversee an organization called Shelter Skate Church here in Greenville, South Carolina. So weekly we eat meals with our community at the skate park. We have faith-based conversations, and we hang out, and we've been doing this for a number of years. And so he says, they feel like misfits, and, you know, you're with them all the time, so that should be your audience, and you should call it Misfit Gospel. And I thought, okay, cool. I still don't know what to do. And so he rattled off all these things that were simple to him, but because I'm neurodivergent and I get really sidetracked really easy, I blanked out. So now, come 2024, I'm talking to my pastor at the church I go to now, and I say, I want to do a podcast. And he goes, let's do it. And I said, huh. So now I think we're in episode 7, and I'm grateful for all the help and support that I've had in attempting to do a thing that I didn't even plan on really doing. At least when I thought I had an idea of what I wanted to do, I still didn't really have any intention, and sometimes you need people to push you along, and I'm thankful for the people that have been willing to sacrifice their time and effort to let me talk into a microphone and talk to my friends and record it. Because even though I like doing it, it still seems really odd to put myself out here and suggest that people should watch me talk. But nonetheless, here we are, and I want it to benefit somebody. So I'm 48 years old. And so I was born in a generation called what they call Gen X. And it's very interesting now that because of social media, everybody wants to compare generations and get in arguments and get all weirded out with each other. And the fun thing has been to find out a whole lot of people my age or a little bit older than me felt similar things about what it was like growing up. And so I was born in November of 1976 in northern Michigan, so in the UP, as they call it, the Upper Peninsula in Sault Ste. Marie. I'm practically Canadian. My father was in the Air Force, and my mom drove a shuttle bus for the people that were coming and going off the base. And so my mother gets pregnant, they get married, and I'm a twin. I'm 3 months premature. I immediately need surgery, and my life is saved. But with preemies, the lungs are usually the last thing to develop, and my twin brother Jeremiah did not survive. And so it's always been a very interesting thing to talk about the one that probably shouldn't have survived, be the one that did. Now, my parents did not have a good relationship. My mom was a simple, very quiet person who married a very volatile man. So he was violent and abusive to her in many, many ways. And then in turn, he would be to his own children. I have a sister who is 4 years younger than I am. And, I'm finding that I hear it a lot more often lately that men are talking about things like this that have happened to them. And it's basically men my age. And the funny thing is, I read recently in a comment thread from a reel where it said, why in the world is it that the baby boomer generation seemed to have put out so many narcissists and now we're hearing about it? And I thought about it and I said, well, it's not so much that the baby boomer generation just had a bunch of narcissists in it. It's just they gave birth to Gen X and all we have is questions on why you did what you did and how you did it and where were you and all the things, because Generation X is most likely the first generation to have mom and dad working full-time out of the house all the time. And in a lot of ways, my generation raised itself. So the funny joke is we stayed out all day, rode our bikes anywhere we wanted for miles and miles, and we drank water from hoses. All true. Well, that's because no one was at home, so why would we stay home? We had 3 channels on the TV, and we could go anywhere we wanted, so you leave. Why drink out of a hose? Well, because no one carried around water bottles. That's not a thing. So if you're thirsty, you're resourceful. Generation X is resourceful. There's a hose. Get a drink. Let's go. We got bike riding to do. But the interesting thing about my generation is people still didn't listen to nuance and detail. So my father was physically abusive to my mom in terrible ways. He was also what they call now spiritually abusive, basically using the Bible and weaponizing it to give him authority in a place where he already was physically dangerous and vocally dangerous, emotionally dangerous. But he also misrepresented Christianity to my mom as well. Both my parents are very influenced by what's called the Jesus movement or the Jesus Revolution, where the late 60s and into the early 70s, hippies were becoming Christians, and it was global almost, especially in the United States. It was a very huge religious outpouring here, and it influenced my parents. So my mom had a genuine interest in Jesus. It's just the only Christian she knew was my dad, and he really wasn't that good of a representative of our faith. And this is usually when someone chimes in and says, See, that's why I don't deal with organized Christianity. And I was like, well, or organized religion in general. And I say, well, guess what? My father's poor religious expression has nothing to do with my faith or Christianity or any spiritual discipline at all. He was an undisciplined man who really only cared about himself. But on the outside, no one knew that. My parents ended up separating when I was 6, and somehow my dad convinced my mom that they should remain married. And it's really processing as I've gotten older that I realized it was just another way for him to keep control of a woman that he didn't want to live with anymore. My mother subsequently became addicted to speed, so it's an amphetamine because of the people she started associating with once we moved out. But she was still the safe parent, which is very, very interesting. By the time I'm 10 years old, we live on the east side of Flint, Michigan. My parents had moved down to Flint, Michigan, so my father could work for General Motors a year after I was born. So that's really where I lived the bulk of my life. And where we lived, we were like a 5-minute walk from where my dad would work. And my dad had a car. My mom did not have a car. So he would park in the driveway, and then she could borrow his car. That seems very genuine and on the outside, or it's helpful on the outside, but they would end up arguing about how far she drove or how much gas she used or this, that, and the other thing. And so when you're 10 years old, 11 years old, and that's your normal, you already just kind of tune things out. I was living in a world where you just weren't safe with the people you're supposed to be safe with. And there's so much information out in the world right now where this is people's story. And so this is when people start tuning out, because I really think that we get so much information thrown at us constantly. We can find out about any horrible thing happening globally, and we're just numb. So it's hard to tell a personal story without someone saying, yeah, I saw a reel about that, I saw a video about that, I saw a movie about that, and people are just numb to it. And so sometimes it just doesn't really feel that important to talk. But nonetheless, by the time I'm like 10 or 11, that's when I start having memories of my sister. Up from between 6 and 10, I don't even remember where she's at. Just because life had made it so that my mind was shutting things out and closing things out. And in a way, that ended up being a gift, because I was completely overwhelmed as it was. I found myself hiding away to read this graphic novel Bible that I was given, and I loved the narrative of the book. I loved the people in the book. See, I didn't have anybody interjecting a narrative or a storyline so that when I read a specific story to have a predetermination of what I was supposed to learn and what I was supposed to get out of it. Now, don't jump ahead of me. I'm not saying that any constructive teaching about what Bible stories mean and the overarching lessons are supposed to mean, or they're supposed to be interpreted. But as a kid in a world that's extremely scary, I found a safe place in this story that God, the Creator, was making His story move through these people, good and bad and indifferent, all kinds of families. And none of these people were really necessarily people you would end up meeting, because they were so different, and they didn't have very many things in common. And some were rich, and some were very poor. Some were royal, and some were not. And the most interesting thing to me was God took a nation of slaves, they were a people group that were slaves in Egypt. And he saves them from slavery, and then he takes them into the desert to teach them how to be human. See, I understood what it was like to feel like I had no power, to feel like I always had a presence over me, threatening me. And it wasn't God. It was my dad. It was like God and then my dad. So it was like my dad had this he was the wall between me and God. It didn't keep me from faith. It kept me from good understanding of who God was and how safe God was. But the God in this Bible I was reading was very powerful and cared very much about justice and cared very much about making sure things went the way they were supposed to go, because it was his story. And these people that he saved and brought out into the desert to teach them what it meant to be human, and teach them what it meant to belong, and teach them what it meant to have a sense of value, they had a hard time with that. It wasn't because they didn't want to believe it, it's just they had no concept of it. The concept of humanity and putting other people first and trusting the God that created you was bizarre. It wasn't because they didn't believe in gods. They already believed in gods. They already believed in the supernatural things. They'd already seen supernatural things. That wasn't the problem. The problem was no God had ever come to people and said, hey, I'm going to be your God. You're going to be my people. I'm going to teach you how to be a nation. You got to stick close to me. And so when people would rise up and get in God's way and threaten the freedoms of the rest, he would take them out. And so I know on this side of Jesus and on this side of Christianity, people don't realize that they read Christianity into the Old Testament of the Bible, where Christianity didn't exist yet because Christ had not come. And so they try to frame God in their own morality, their own version of his morality, and pin him to the wall, saying those people shouldn't have died as a punishment to harming those people. And I say, he's kind of God. That's just the way the story went. And it's even hard to explain it now, because I'm just saying, when I read it, I said, that makes sense. I don't know why there aren't people like that who say this guy's wrong and we need justice here, and these people are innocent, because in my world that wasn't the case. But I hid with that book. So around 11 years old, my parents are fighting in the driveway, and I was just frustrated. And so I was a kid, and so I took my mom to the side. I asked her to go inside the house with me, and I told her about some things that my father had been doing to me that I had not told anybody yet. Because not only was he verbally abusive and just a scary human to me as a kid, he had also been sexually abusing me. And it's very confusing when you're a little kid, because you really don't have any concept of your body, and then you don't really have a concept of what's right and wrong. You just know things look weird or sound weird. And I remember when I was a kid, there used to be PSAs in between television shows, but they always gave off the idea that the person that was the culprit or the abuser was somebody other than your parent. It was always somebody outside the family or a distant relative, and they always threatened the victim, don't tell anybody. That never happened to me. So somehow I didn't connect the two, that the things that they were inferring on TV was the things that was happening to me. And so I just decided to tell my mom this one day, and she gets on the phone, she calls the police, and the police come. You see, the police didn't roll through my neighborhood. My neighborhood, I wouldn't say it was impoverished. You could walk through it during the daytime, but probably not at nighttime. In my neighborhood in the 80s, the only I would say, unlawful element would have been the local one percenters, which is motorcycle enthusiasts that don't always cooperate with the law. And I think they enforced a lot of things in the neighborhoods and kept them safer than you would think. Because my mama knew a lot of those people and associated with a lot of those people. And so the police come to our house, and my mom talks to them, and then she walks away, and then they talk to my dad, and then they drive away. And my dad walks over to both of us, and he says, "God has forgiven me, and there isn't anything you can do about this." And I said, "Oh." And again, I wasn't mad at God. I thought, well, God does forgive. Maybe I was wrong. I'm going to have to think about this, because my world is still telling me that how I feel doesn't really matter. I don't think God feels that way about me. But hey, the police didn't do their job as far as I understood they should have. And that just kind of shut me down from talking about things. It didn't stop the abuse. That would still remain for a while. And it's after going through trauma therapy in recent years that I can explain it, because right now the word trauma is everywhere, and I hate hearing it, because for those of us who have actually really experienced mind-altering, emotionally shattering things that really ruined our lives at one point, when someone just throws this word around constantly like a colloquialism, it's really disturbing and it's really frustrating. But nonetheless, I have to use the word because that's the word that fits. So I would just find something to hide my mind in, to hide my thoughts in, to get focused on. I didn't know that I was neurodivergent as a kid. I wouldn't know that until just a few years ago. So since I have ADHD, I now know that I would just get hyper-focused on different things that would satisfy a need in my mind that would settle me. So I'll get really into the Bible, and it fed something in my soul, but it also occupied my mind, and I really believe that satisfied something in me and made me feel safe. And I really believe I met God there in those times. But then I loved movies, and I loved to hear stories where people that shouldn't win. Movies like The Never-Ending Story and The Karate Kid, and just movies where people rise above, because I wanted to believe that I could. And the 80s and the 90s are just full of movies that are coming-of-age stories. They start out pretty rough. They learn a lesson. They don't end with happy endings, but it's a little bit better. And it's funny that, again, I'm probably on social media too much, but I notice that people comment a lot about things they don't understand. People that are Gen Z are watching movies from when I was a kid and saying, these are horrible movies. How could people watch these things? They have all these bad things happening to them, and where were their parents and stuff like that? And I'm like, chill. We watched movies that represented our lives, and we walked away believing we could be better. And we weren't looking for entertainment. We were looking for hope. So I watched a movie called Thrashing. And it's kind of a B movie, but it's about skateboarding. But in the skateboarding world, it's more of a cult classic. And I didn't know any skateboarders, but I watched the movie and I said, I want that. And so I got a skateboard. We went to Kmart and got me my first skateboard, and I was about that life. By 11 years old, I'm just pushing this skateboard everywhere. Now, you're going to have to erase from your mind Tony Hawk and all of the other things that you might think you know about skateboarding, unless you are someone watching this that does know about skateboarding. Pushing your skateboard is skateboarding, and I would just cruise the streets in my neighborhood. Now, there was a larger skateboarding community around me that I didn't know of. I mean, I was just a kid. We couldn't afford to go to the skate shop, so I would just get things about skateboarding here and there. I ended up going to a roller skating shop that was closing, and they sold skateboarding things. So I got my first pro deck, which was an H Street brand deck. It was Tony Magnuson. It has a cartoon of a kid on the bottom, and he's holding a giant T or a cross, whichever one it was. I was allowed to buy that because most professional skateboarding decks were not, we'll say, Christian friendly. And for those of us who like skateboarding when we were kids, we couldn't buy those images. And so while I'm at this roller skate shop and I get this deck, I also see that they have stacks and stacks of magazines, and I'm curious about the magazines, and they're like, we're closing, you can have all of them. And I'm talking about a good 20 or 30 issues of a magazine called Transworld Skateboarding. And so this is probably 1989, and I took them all, and I flipped through all of them, and I tore out pages and posters, and I just wallpapered my room with them. And if you know about skateboarding, or if you don't, you can just Google it, but a lot of the photography is from J. Grant Britton, iconic pictures of the Bones Brigade, which would be Tony Hawk and Steve Caballero and Lance Mountain, and I won't name them all, but famous ads, things that are iconic in skateboarding. At then, it was just all brand new to me, and I wanted to look at it all the time. Because I lived in the Midwest, I lived in Michigan, I couldn't ride my skateboard all the time, but I fell in love with the artwork. And so that was a new obsession for me. I would learn the artwork of skateboarding and design and graphics. And, and I tell skaters, I say, I never wanted to be pro. And they're like, what are you talking about? You didn't want to go pro? I said, no. They're like, why? And I said, because I wanted to design. Someone has to design the graphics for your decks and your stickers and your T-shirts. Someone's got to do that. I want to do that. And they're like, all right, that's valid. But they still don't get it. But it's cool because it was another thing that helped me deal with the world around me. And that's pretty much what I cared about. I only knew one other skater. Now, around this time, my mom became a Christian. And I say became a Christian because I think her life with my dad, I really don't know that she ever told God that she wanted him to save her, that she wanted to be a follower of Jesus. I think she was just married to a Christian, and she wasn't averse to it. I had always heard about Christian things and things from the Jesus movement, specifically a ministry called Jesus People USA out of Chicago, and they put out their own music, and I'd hear about music, and they had a newspaper, And so my mom, who wasn't a Christian, enjoyed Christian things made by Christians, but finally she had come to her own decision to follow Jesus, and she was clean and sober, like miraculously. And we go from having to go to our father's on the weekends to not anymore, because now mom's a Christian and we really had no reason to go to his house anymore. And my mom did something I'd never seen Christians do, which is go into the street and tell people about Jesus. I'd never seen anybody do that. And it's very simple. She'd walk up to somebody and say, hey, can I tell you what Jesus did for me? And if they say yes, then you do. And if they say no, then you don't. And I was pretty amazed by this because I was a real skittish kid. I was a real anxious kid, really panicky. But this was encouraging because we didn't just go out to random cities. We went to our own city and we went to our own neighborhood, to people that actually knew who we were. And so people knew my mom had been a drug addict last week, and now she's talking about Jesus. And that was really encouraging to me. Now, I still didn't understand the relationship with Jesus part. I still knew the Bible really, really well. But still, no one had explained the Jesus part. But she starts going to church, and at the church she's going to, I make a friend there, and he's actually into skateboarding, but he lives about 25 minutes away by expressway. So it's not like he lives close to me. And yes, we became really good friends, and I would go to his house, and we would skate a lot, but I'd always have to go back to skating my streets at home, because you couldn't skate in the church's parking lot because, look, in the late 80s or early 90s, if you had a skateboard, you were a bad guy. It was nothing cool about skateboarding. There was no household names. It was just you're not a good kid. Don't even think about taking that skateboard out of your parents' vehicle and taking it into the church parking lot. Oh, how I wish there were people that do what my wife and I do now. Then that would have been really helpful. After becoming a Christian, my mom had renal failure. Her kidneys failed her, and she ended up being on dialysis. And so my world really shifted. My mom becoming stronger and stronger in her faith. We still have my dad visiting at least once a day or every other day, because he had a right to come see his children. And so he'd still pick us up from school or do things like that. And you don't think about it. You don't say, oh, I don't want to go. But you're not excited about it either. When you don't have a say, you just don't have a say. And even though my mom is living this really free life, my dad still represents himself as a really strong believer or whatever. And he does all the right things. He pays child support. He has really nice suits when he goes to church. And he sings on the platform on Sunday morning, and people think he's A1. And why not, right? Because he's still legally married to my mother, so on the outside, she's just his estranged wife. And it is a real big hustle. My mom ends up going in the hospital one summer night when I was 13. And who's there going to stay with us but my dad, who was legally her husband. So and the reason I say it this way, because it's only been recently that I've put these things together, and I say it this way also to bring home the oddity of it. Because something happened to me that night to where it hadn't happened in a few years. And you say, well, how could you be around that person? Why wouldn't you just automatically think he's going to do this and this? I said, I can't understand how the brain works. All I know is I was always severely anxious around the man. He was always very sharp with his words, very sarcastic and mocking of me and the things I was into. But at the same time, I was so used to that. But my mind had blocked out any of the violent things or any of the really vulgar things. And I don't know why, and I don't even know how to understand how it works, even after therapy. So when he's there, all I cared about was, I hope he's cool, I hope he's chill, and that's all I care about. I didn't believe in getting angry and hateful at your parents. It wasn't even something in my mind. I just focused on what was happening to me in the moment, and I think that's part of being neurodivergent also. You get hyper-focused on what's right in front of you, and you can easily push things out, and in a lot of ways, I think having ADHD in part saved my life as well. The next day, my mom is home from the hospital, and I had a paper route, and so I'm rolling my newspapers, and I explained to her what had happened, and I said, I want to go talk to the police. And she says, okay, I'll take you down police station. So I sit with the detectives, and I explain to them what happened, and they ask me a lot of questions, and I'm getting really disoriented and confused because I realized they weren't necessarily on my side, and I was just at a loss because somewhere in the middle of the night and in the middle of me telling their story, I ran out of information because the story goes blank in my mind. And either the police force at that time might not have been very aware of trauma in children, or teenagers, or they didn't know what they were looking for, or they weren't looking at all because they seemed really indignant. They say, "Why were you there?" I say, "I lived there." They're like, "Why was he there?" I was like, "He's my dad. My mom was in the hospital. I'm a kid." But I was 13, 5'7", probably 140. And all they did was see someone who could have defended themselves. They didn't see someone whose mind just turned off so he could handle the distress of what's going on around him. And so I left again, wondering what in the world just happened, because I thought if I told them face to face myself, but in reality it was they knew things had happened before, and this still looked like an estranged wife who's now sick, who's trying to pull one over on her legal husband. And I was like devastated quietly. So a few months go by and I'm back in school. I'm in the 8th grade, and CPS comes to my school and they pull me out of class, and where they're asking me all these questions. Are you okay? Or is this and that? And I say, yeah, I'm fine. No, nothing's happening to me. I'm okay. Because I've already just tuned it out. And they say, okay. And I go home that day, and I'm just at a loss. And I walk into my bedroom, and I take it out on the only thing I could think of taking out, and I rip down all my skateboarding posters, everything that was skateboarding related. I put it all in a trash bag, and I put it to the curb. I took my skateboard, and I took it to school, and I traded it for Nirvana's Nevermind album on cassette. And in a way, it was like, if no one's going to help me, I won't help me. I won't hold on to the thing that I care about. So in a way, it was kind of like a form of self-harm, because it always hurt that I had given it away. And no one ever asked what I did. No one asked where my skateboard was. No one asked what happened to my room. And so I just turned off. I just stopped paying attention to a lot of things. But I always looked like a good kid because I'm always hyper-focused on things. I was always very quiet. I do what my mom said. Did I do a lot of stupid things? Yes. But as soon as I did something stupid, my mom would call me out on it, and I'd do what she said, and then I'd find another stupid thing to do. Because I didn't really enjoy the stupid things I was doing, like drinking and messing around with girls and trying to steal things from the store. It wasn't enjoyable. It was just something to do. Because I noticed something about myself, that I would be so focused on people around me that it was almost like I could feel what they were feeling. I now know that's called like a being empathetic. I'm very aware of people's feelings, but then it was more like a torment because I was uncomfortable around people, and I was fully aware that people my age were struggling. And I was fully aware, at least through my perception, that adults around us had turned off. And God had become somebody that I talked to right before I went to bed and told him all the things that I felt like were wrong with my world and that I might have done wrong, that might have offended him. And I would ask him to forgive me, and please don't send me to hell if I die. Because at that point, the only way I could think of talking to God was if I felt wrong or I felt bad, because in general speaking, I was always feeling like I was wrong, like I was bad. And that would last for years. A month before I turned 18 years old, my mom says, it's a Tuesday night, so this would have been October 1994. My mom says, hey, we're going to church tonight. And I was like, Mom, I'll go to church Sunday. I'll go to church Wednesday. It's Tuesday, and I know there's no church tonight. And she says, yeah, it's at another church. There's a revival at another church, and you're going. Now, generally, everybody knows you don't argue with my mom. It's just not a thing. However, I thought I'd give it a shot anyway because I was going out that night. And I was a nice boy, but I was a very selfish boy, and I wanted to do what I wanted to do with the person that I was going to do it with. But we made an agreement. We'll drive separately. I'll go to church. When it's over, I'll go do what I planned on doing. So I sit through the service. I have nothing wrong. I don't have a problem with God's people. I don't have a problem with church. I don't have a problem with preaching. I enjoy a good teacher. It was the Jesus part that I didn't understand, though I did not reject it. And you say, how did you not know the Jesus part? I was like, well, I understood Jesus was a Savior, and I understood I could ask to be forgiven of things. I believed he was the Son of God, but there was just something that wasn't connecting. And so that night, at the end of the service, it's a very small church. I'm in the last pew closest to the door. I'm ready to leave. And like the service is over. And I lock eyes with the woman who had been preaching, and I thought, oh no. And she looked at me and she motioned to me, and I said, oh no, not right now, not now. And it was, I got up and I started walking to the front because I knew what was about to happen, but I didn't want it to happen. And I got to the front and she says, God has saved your life 3 times. And he's asking you to choose him, and he won't ask you again. And I was like, whoa, God wants me to choose him? I didn't know I had a say in this thing. I didn't know that God was choosing me and I was choosing him back. I said, okay. Yeah, sure. I didn't pray a fancy prayer. I've never once prayed a salvation prayer where you bow your head and, say some manufactured soliloquy to God. I just said, okay. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I thought if God wants my attention, he's got it. I still went out with that girl that night. We didn't do anything because I needed to tell her what I had just done. And so she looked really confused, and so she's like, we're not going to do the other things we were going to do? And I was like, no. And she's like, okay. And that was the end of that. But it would still plague me because I really didn't know how to talk to God. Now I was more happy to be in church. I was more happy to listen to teaching and try to figure it out. But I had no one really telling me how to do this or what to do or how to do it. So I just stuck with what I knew. Praying a really sad, lonely prayer at night. Trying to be good. I had long hair, like down to my shoulders. I mean, this is the mid-90s. I listened to Nirvana. I really liked alternative clothing, if you will. That's a thing now, branding, how we dressed in the 90s. But yeah, T-shirts and flannels and jeans and boots. But I also listened to a lot of hip-hop music, and I spoke a lot of slang, so I was just a hodgepodge of a lot of things. And I decided to go to art school, but I wasn't emotionally and mentally prepared, not even to live away from home. I come home very disappointed and frustrated, and I'm like, school isn't for me. And so I'm talking to the pastor of our church, and I say, I don't know what to do with myself. I'm trying to be a Christian. I'm really not sure what that was. I wasn't sure what it was that I was supposed to be doing. I just didn't understand. And he said, well, I want you to do this. I want you to go talk to the youth pastor, have lunch with him, tell him you want to work in the youth ministry. I was like, you can do that? And he said, yeah, you can do that. Go talk to him. See, because subsequently, while I was in college for that year, the church had gotten a new youth pastor, and I didn't know him. And he was in his mid to late 30s, which was pretty old for a youth pastor. You just didn't see it that much. But I sat down and I talked with him. Within a year, I was an intern in the church, and I just watched every single thing he did. Because he was bold, and he could talk to anybody at the drop of a hat, of any age, and I was like, I want that. in a lot of the ways people know me now, where I'm a little more outspoken, I can be a little aggressive, I'm a lot more insistent on what I have to say. By and large, I got it from him. And so I would work in youth ministry for a while, and so mentally I'm thinking, well, I must probably going to become a youth pastor, so I got to get married. And people warned me not to get married. But once I'm on go, I went and I got married, and I was really not emotionally or mentally prepared to be married, to take care of another human. Because even up to that point on black and white paper, I was perfect for a husband. My mom had been bedridden for almost 2 years, and I had been her chore provider. I worked 30 hours a week at the radio station, and I served in the church, and hey, he must be perfect. But I was burning my candle at both ends. I was actually probably more like a pile of wax. And then I get married, and everything got quiet, and everything that I knew was gone. And all I had was this other person looking at me like, okay, this is our life now. And it wasn't good. We had a daughter very quickly within the first year, and she is the best thing that came out of that marriage. We stayed married for full eight years. But we were probably only together for 7 of them. Just a lot of miscommunication, confusion, frustration, panic, all of these things that I still had no words for. I was still living in a way emotionally and mentally that I'd always lived. And it was like life was putting a magnifying glass on it and just making a mockery out of me. In 2007, she divorced me, and I was living in my mom's basement. I was frustrated. I was irritated. I was angry. And I thought, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. It didn't feel the same being at home. It didn't feel the same being living with my mom. I didn't feel comforted. I was so angry. I stopped telling my mom that I loved her. And I subsequently had started having seizures. And then I couldn't legally drive, which made it really hard to have a job. And so I was just living this really stereotypical, weird, uncomfortable, anxious life, not knowing what to do with myself. Because it was obviously something wrong, but I didn't know what was wrong. And I always had the same thoughts and voices coming from the outside telling me what was wrong. You just got to get some gumption. You just got to get busy. Put your hands to work. Do this, do that. But I'd say, why can't I concentrate? Why am I so confused? Why do I feel like everything is going blank when I walk out the door? Why can't I seem to function? What's going on? Well, what you just need to do is go to therapy, talk it out, work it out. They'll give you some medicine, get a job. Be a man. And I thought, well, I am a man. It's just something's wrong. Something's off. So it's like that for 3 years. I try internet dating, and that's a joke. That's just weird. And my sister was moving out of state, and she was out of town house hunting, and she had me house sit for her. Now, her best friend had my nephews, so my 3 nephews were staying with her best friend, but I was watching the dog at her house, and it's still kind of confusing why I didn't just watch my nephews too, but that's neither here nor there. So I had the keys to the house, and I had her best friend's phone number so that we could stay in touch so I could make sure the house was open for her. She comes over. One day we sit down, we have a conversation because I didn't have anything else to do. And I'm like, I like this girl. She's cool. And because I didn't really know any of my sister's friends, I said, well, this is a good one. I didn't think I'd see her again. 2 weeks later, I still have her phone number in my phone. I text her. I say, hey, I met this girl. I'd like to talk to her again. What do you think I should do? Because I am a dork like that. And that's how I talk. I have no game whatsoever. So for the next month, she and I would hang out, and we'd go to church together, we'd eat pizza, we'd watch movies together. I can't even say we were dating because we didn't talk about it. If I sat on a couch with her to watch a movie, there was always a couch cushion in between us, because at that point I was so frustrated I didn't even want to even look like I was trying to do something inappropriate. But within a couple weeks of doing those things, I found that I had proposed to her, and that was the spring of 2009. In January 2010, we were married. It's my wife, Jennifer. And it's tough because she had never seen a man struggle so much in her life. Because the idea is, how can you preach to youth groups? Because I would still speak at youth groups and to teenagers. And she's like, how can you do this? And how can you know all the Bible and also be such an emotional mess? And I'd say, I don't know. And we'd go round and round about it. And a lot of times I would just end up in tears. Like, I would just be breaking down. And I thought, is this all my life is? She and I have 4 children together, and after 5 years of being together, we decided we're going to uproot our family and move to Greenville, South Carolina. My wife and I are perfect for each other. When we're working together, we do the thing. We just get it done. When we're working, especially to serve people or in the street, because we did very similar things that my mom did, only with whatever church we would go to. We just had struggles communicating because I'm a terrible communicator. I was just horrible at talking about what I was thinking. Why? Because in a lot of ways, now I know that I could never figure out what to say or when to say or how to say it, because they call it executive dysfunction. Disorganized, frustrated, confused, sidetracked. It's not about being hyper. It's about not being able to control all the ideas in your mind at one time to focus on one thing. And it's really, really hard. And it made my wife's life hard. We had friends that moved to Greenville, South Carolina, and we came to visit. And while we were here in 2016, we attended a church that we'd been listening to podcasts to. And in the middle of the service, I said, can we just move here? And in our style, in 3.5 weeks, we were moved. Because my now 14-year-old daughter was about to start kindergarten. So we got down here so she could start kindergarten. And we're still figuring out how to communicate. We're still trying to figure out how to do this, because now we don't have any buffers. I moved to another state at 39 years old. And at that point, I had been the stay-at-home parent because we didn't want daycare raising our children. And so my wife, who had done hair for 15 years, retired from doing hair. She said, I want you to work now. And I said, fine. But it wasn't easy. It took us 2 months to find an apartment, a month to find a job. But while in that time, one of the most important conversations we'd have is, who are we going to serve here? It didn't seem like we saw churches going out of their way to serve people in the community or do things, as far as we could tell. And the church we were going to didn't do anything outside of the walls. And trust me, I tried to talk to the pastor a number of times about that. I'd say, what in the world are we doing for the community? And he never really had an answer for me. It's no shade. It's just he didn't have an answer. And so We were like, what are we going to do? And so my daughter, who was then 3, I come home from work and my wife tells me that Stella wants to ride a skateboard. And I was like, really? And she says, yeah. And she said, I showed her these videos, and it was of these little girls out in California wearing pink helmets and tutus and riding skateboards. And of course, a 3-year-old little girl is going to want to do that. So I was like, well, where's a skate park? So we hunt for a skate park, and we find a DIY park here in Greenville that skaters made. And I take her and I say, you want to do that? And she says, yeah, I want to do that. I was like, okay. I was like, where's the skate shop? So we find the local skate shop. And in a month, Stella would turn 4. And so she got her first setup, helmets, pads, and the whole deal. By the spring, my daughter Veda, who was then 6, she also wanted to ride a skateboard. And she was going through a very interesting thing herself, because she was diagnosed with juvenile idiopathic arthritis, which is, for all intents and purposes, a kind of like rheumatoid in a way. It's tough to see in children. But she had went into remission, and so she started skateboarding. And then come Father's Day 2017, I'm 40 years old, and I have my first setup in 26 years, and I'm riding a skateboard again. And we're at the skate park a lot, because now I have kids that want to be there. And so we're there, and my wife and I are looking around, and we're like, oh, these are the people we're going to serve. These guys. We're like, okay. So basically what serving is, if you're a follower of Jesus, you go and do good things for people because they're there. Not because you're starting a ministry. It's because they're there. Ministry means serving. So if you're a Christian, you're supposed to serve. Welcome to the ministry. So what we did was take to doing things for people. Because when it's 85 degrees in South Carolina and skateboarders are out there all day long on the pavement without water and without food, because skateboarding is important. When it's your lifestyle, it's very, very important, and it really doesn't matter. You'll do without as long as you can skate. So if I have Gatorade, you have Gatorade. If I have water, you have water. And there were times when we were able to afford to show up to the park where my wife would say, how many people are here? And she'd say, okay, I'll be right back. She'd get some hot and readies, bring them to the park. And I think one of the first times we did this, I just looked around. I don't really know anybody. I don't like talking, believe it or not. I don't like large crowds, believe it or not. But I go off of a burst of adrenaline and I say, yo, who's hungry here? And people look at me like, what? I'm like, I got pizza. Who's hungry? And people are like, no, appreciate you. That's cool. We're good. I'm like, whoa. You've been here all day. You have no water and no food. I've got food and water. You need to come eat. Don't make my wife go do things for nothing. And they weren't used to hearing that. And I was just like, well, I said it. But they ate, and it was cool. But I didn't go and say, all right, now pray a prayer with me. I need to tell you about Jesus. No, I was just showing some love. Not long after that, I get a message on Instagram from someone I didn't know who followed me because I also am an illustrator. I'm into graffiti culture, also the skateboarding design, but I draw on 228 labels, priority mail shipping labels. And a lot of that was prominent on my Instagram page. And so this person followed me for that and just happened to live here. And so he reaches out to me and he says, yo, I was painting at the park and you gave me pizza the other day. And I said, oh, cool. And he says, people don't do that. And I was like, I understand, but we do. He goes, no, you don't understand. People don't do that around here. And we went back and forth, and I said, okay, well, this is the way to go. So we just prayed for skateboarding. We'd pray for the skate park. We'd go there when no one was there and just pray that God would bless the skateboarders, keep them safe, that they would enjoy their activity, that they'd enjoy their culture, that they'd enjoy their community. And after doing that for about 3 years, we were invited to a meeting for a proposed skateboarding ministry. And at that time, people knew we were believers, and we had the opportunity to go to a now indoor skate park a few times to pray over the park before it opened on Saturdays, and it was cool. Still not a ministry. We're just being Christians. And my wife is like, you can go to the meeting. I go, and it's just a bunch of rad dudes in there, awesome skaters, young guys in their 20s with big dreams and big hopes to reach people for Jesus. And I'm like, cool, I'm old. I'm just going to sit and listen and watch. And I tuned out most of it because I start looking at graphics and decks and things hanging on the walls, and I immediately start thinking of designs. I'm like, they're going to need a logo, they're going to need merch, probably, and things like that. And that's just where my brain goes. Within 6 months, we're meeting twice a month at the indoor skate park. I'm teaching like at least once every other month. My wife is making food. We're not organized. My wife and I are not over it. Other people are running it and making sure that we can go come in and out of the park. But we weren't under a banner or a covering of any kind. We all just had the same idea. Let's bless the skate community for Jesus. And that community started to fizzle out a bit because people have busy lives. And we weren't a real church, quote unquote. We just called ourselves Greenville Skate Church. And, it was becoming very youth groupy. Like church moms were getting the idea that their kid would rather go there instead of go to their church youth group. And they'd come in and just dropping kids off, and we're chasing moms out into the parking lot saying, well, you got to sign waivers, and this is a skate park. You can't just drop your kid off here. Oh, they're here for church. I'm like, okay, yes, this is a meeting. We call it Skate Church, but it's more of a colloquialism so that skateboarders understand we're going to talk about Jesus. And they'll say, aren't you the pastor? I'm like, no, we don't have a pastor. What do you mean? We're not a church. Oh, okay, well, I was like, would you please come sign the waiver? And that was starting to happen a lot. And sometimes people just aren't called to it. This was a great community of people that I love and people that still help now. But people's lives were different. Some people were moving on to other action sports ministries, and some people were just like, you know what, I can't give my time to this. I can't really give enough attention to this the way it deserved, and they have to back up. But at this point, my wife and I are always contacting people and learning and trying to figure out what it looks like to have a skateboarding ministry thrive, just because we're curious. We just naturally go after it. And we found ourselves in Florida at an organization in South Florida who does world missions with action sports. And we knew some people that were serving there. And we just asking questions and hanging out. And the director and founder of the organization says to me, he says, it sounds like you lead an organization or a ministry that you don't have any authority over. And I was like, oh, well, shots fired. Yeah, I guess so. Because as it turns out, I was realizing how many people looked towards me and my wife as leaders. And I was realizing some people didn't like it and some people thought it was great. And we were getting really uncomfortable with it because we were considering quitting. Not quitting serving people, but the whole being a collective of people doing an outreach night. But now it was a challenge, and so we had to talk about this. Well, are we supposed to do this? Let's ask God about it. Let's talk about it. I get home, and I sit down with a good friend of mine who was part of the original team that started what was called Greenville Skate Church. And he tells me, I'm out. I serve in the church with the youth. He manages cafes. And I can't give this the time it deserves, and we're all following you and Jen anyway. You have to take it over or it's done. And I thought, wow, okay. Well, let me go talk to Jen. And she said, because we had already been tossing around a word, shelter. What was it for? What would we do? We don't know. Should we create our own nonprofit and just go serve people? I don't know. And so I bring this to her, and she says, okay. She says, if we're changing the name then. I said, fine. And a lot of that was confusing because some people didn't understand what had happened, and there was a shift. And some people totally understood and were on board with it, and then some people were just kind of like, what are you guys doing? Because we're middle-aged people running a ministry that is action sports oriented specifically for skateboarding. And so we use the word shelter because as a middle-aged man who is a husband and a father and an uncle and a brother, I recognize that I should be a safe place. As a person that has gone through suffering and abuse and torment at the hands of people that were supposed to protect me or people that were supposed to save me from these things legally or pastors that just wouldn't do anything, I thought, you know what, if I'm in this situation, I've got to be safe. We need to be a covering and a shelter for people. So my wife and I agreed. In September 23, we became an official nonprofit organization called Shelter Skate Church. And it's because basically it gives you some clout in the community. But to do what we do, anybody could do it because all you have to do is go love people. But what I've found is suffering has had a purpose. And don't hear me say what I'm not saying. God did not make bad things happen to me so that good could come about. Not at all. But subsequently, after these bad things have happened, and after I have gone to him with all of this struggle for years, after I have gone to EMDR, trauma therapy, and really tried to focus and learn how to talk about these things and learn about my health and become healthy or healthier, I found that these things could be used because now I know that when I can sense something wrong with somebody, I can speak into it. I can help somebody because when I look at them, I see me. People will really try to use Jesus' name and throw it around, and they really, basically, they want to chop out the idea that you got to answer to God for your sins or ever ask God to save you and just say, you just got to be loving and see Jesus in people. And I say, that's wrong. Jesus isn't in people, because if Jesus was in people, Jesus wouldn't have had to come and we wouldn't even know who he was. See, what we need to see is us in people, our own struggle in people, our own hurt in people. And we find those things in common and we go and be an answer to that need. We serve, we help, we meet needs. Because the Bible says that Jesus went about doing good and healing all that were oppressed of the enemy. So doing good must be a precursor to seeing people healed. Before Jennifer and I started doing things the way we do now, it's at the same skate park where I first started skateboarding again, where all my kids have essentially grown up. My now son, Micah, who is 6, and my daughter, Zola, who was 1 when we first started going there. She's now 10. My family has been at this skate park for almost 9 years. And I couldn't imagine my life without it. But to backpedal a little bit, to seal it for me, In 2021, I went to a wedding, and a friend of mine who was a pastor in Florida, was there, and we had been interns, 25, almost 30 years ago together at the church. And he says, "This makes so much sense." I was like, "What makes so much sense?" He goes, "You with the tattoos," and because he hadn't seen me in a while. So at that time, I had stretched ears, and I have tattoos, and I have 4 more children that he had never met, nor he had not met my wife. And he goes, "You have all these kids, and you work and you serve in a skate park?" And I was like, "Yeah." He goes, "That's awesome." And I'm like, "Why is this such a big deal to you?" And he goes, "Don't you know what Keith did?" Now, Keith is the name of the youth pastor from the church that I subsequently went and talked to when I was 19 years old. And I had forgotten that he had been a youth pastor. His first pastorate was in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and that's like an hour north of Greenville. And he said he did skateboarding ministry. And I was like, "What?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "You're doing the same thing." You see, I carried a lot of grief and a lot of weight because I went through a divorce. I had mental traumas and issues, and it didn't look like I was that great of a man on the outside stereotypically. And in my imagination, all my friends had become pastors or youth pastors or worship leaders in the church, and they were way more spiritually evolved than I was, and I was lost, and I had failed. And in that moment, by faith in my heart, I heard God say, "You're a good son." So as an encouragement to anybody who is a parent or some kind of mentor of any kind, whether you think they're listening or not, they are. We went home from that wedding last night, and I told my wife, I said, "Jen, I need proof. I need proof of that. I believe him, but I need proof." So she did some Googling and found a newspaper article about a youth pastor in Spartanburg, South Carolina, who had built a half pipe in the church's parking lot, and he did all these other amazing things, and things I now remembered him talking about. And I read it, and I was like, "Wow, I talk like him. That's really cool." And also the owner of the local skate park that's been here for 40 years, Blazer, Brian, helped him do skate events. And Brian is also with us every week, and he's also on my board. Things come full circle. And we're always healing, and we're always growing, and we're always strengthening. And so I hope that the stories that come on Misfit Gospel is just all of it. If someone's harmed you, deal with it. If you've harmed someone, deal with it. I explain skateboard ministry like that. Shelter Skate Church is not a church, though we are a nonprofit. I am not an ordained minister yet. But as I understand it, in Alcoholics Anonymous, they're a 12-step program. And the first step is to acknowledge that you are helpless to your addiction. And the second step is to acknowledge a higher power. And so I say, in our ministry setting, when we sit down and talk, I am an addict to sin. I'm an addict to pride. I'm an addict to running away from the truth that is Jesus. I'm an addict to hiding from his love. But I'm 30 years in on my path to spiritual sobriety, and I should be able to teach something and help other people who are new to the path, who are on it less of a time than me, or who have been on it longer than me. Because we need to be saved from ourselves. And we need hope. And I believe that it is Jesus. And whether you know it or not, God knows you right where you are, how you are. And he sees you and he's there. So, with that said, this is my story. I'll stick to it. My name's Josue Rodriguez. This is the Misfit Gospel. There's no such thing as fitting in, so please don't try. We'll see you next time.